Boom. What's happening, everybody? Ryan Thomas here, live on the Thomas Take Sports podcast, bringing you another episode of the show. Diving into the MMA side of things, Jon Jones didn't just, send bad news shockwaves. Finally, at last, Jon Jones is actually doing something right for once. Jon Jones vacated the UFC light heavyweight title about a week and a half ago now. This isn't old news. I think this is relevant news in the mixed martial arts world. This is relevant news in the UFC. This is relevant news to the whole world of MMA. And truthfully, I feel this is the dominating storyline in the sport right now, that Jon Jones vacated the UFC light heavyweight title and has made his remarks that he will be moving up to the UFC heavyweight division. Now, I've tapped into this a little bit here and there on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast Facebook page. Haven't tapped into it nearly enough, and I'm going to in this video tonight, live. So, Jon Jones, as I alluded at the start of the show, did something right. He didn't hold up a division. He didn't leave the contenders of the UFC light heavyweight division in the background. He let them know, hey, I'm going to make a decision about this title. We will know in relatively short fashion whether or not I will be vacating the title, whether or not I will be holding on to the title. Namely, for fighters like Dominic Reyes and Jan Blachowicz, this was extremely important because one of those two guys was set to face off against Jon Jones in the near future anyway. It was set to happen. Whether it was Jan or Dominic Reyes, I personally thought Dominic Reyes deserved an immediate rematch with Jon Jones due to the fact that Jones, let's keep it real here, Jones lost to Dominic Reyes. I just watched the fight. I watched it on UFC Fight Pass. I didn't like what I saw from Jon Jones in that fight. I personally thought that Jon Jones lost that fight. I've watched it multiple times, watching it live, watching it at Zach Finney's house, my buddy Eric Ellis, shout out to those guys, watching it at Zach's house, saying to myself, Reyes won that fight. Jones did not win that fight. That was probably as bad as Jon Jones has looked in quite some time, and Reyes looked phenomenal. He looked fantastic in terms of a challenger versus champion performance. I thought it was one of the best challenger versus champion performances in recent memory. So, being that is the case, and mostly my opinion, I would say if we went on any of the underground forums of mixed martial arts, we would see that most believe that Reyes won that fight, right? I think I'm safe saying that. Am I safe saying that? If not, let me know. Truthfully, let me know. Let me know if I'm not safe in saying that. And I truly believe that Jones dealt with the aftermath of that fight. He looked at that fight with his opponent, Dominic Reyes, his last fight, and said to himself, man, that one was a tough one. I can honestly say, Jon Jones' body language is everything after a fight, and Jon Jones looked as if he thought, man, I might have lost that fight. We hardly ever see that look in the eyes of Jon Jones, and he looked like he thought, man, I might have lost that fight. Might have lost that fight. So when I go back and watch that fight and see how it played out, not only did I think Dominic Reyes won, but I thought he was faster, more athletic, landed the harder shots. Really, the championship rounds, the rounds that Jon Jones is always able to just get this second wind. You go back to the fights, not just with Dominic Reyes, but the fight with Alexander Gustafsson, in particular, the first one, because the second one, he just obliterated Alexander Gustafsson. We saw a fighter that he just didn't seem to have the wherewithal in the first three rounds of that fight. And then the fourth and fifth round, he really turned it on. And the case was similar in the Reyes fight. That just shows the true championship caliber fighter that Jon Jones is. And that's what sets him apart from being a champion to, an all-time great champion. And, giving up that UFC light heavyweight title as, many times as it was vacated twice, they're not vacated, stripped of Jon Jones. That was probably a very tough decision for Jon Jones. It was probably a decision that made Jon Jones think, "Man, this is a tough one. I don't know if I should go down this road of vacating this belt." And I think that's why he deliberated over it for so long. But the idea of Jon Jones moving on from the UFC light heavyweight division is so intriguing to me, due to the fact that we have a fighter that has a lot of fight left in him. He's the youngest UFC champion of all time, in his early 30s now, moving up to heavyweight. And there are a lot of foes out there for Jon Jones to compete against. And I want to dive into who I think he should face in his UFC heavyweight debut. And I know I'm going to get some pushback for this, due to the fact that there are a lot of fans of a particular fighter, as am I. I'll get there. So there's a lot of rumors rolling around as far as who Jon Jones could fight. And those rumors state that Brock Lesnar is out there. Those rumors state that, Alistair Overeem would be honored or humbled to, share the octagon with Jon Jones. And personally, I would like to see that fight. I put out a top 5 list of the 5 fighters that I'd like to see Jon Jones square off against, right, in the heavyweight debut. But the one fight that I want the most, more than any fight, maybe even in mixed martial arts right now, would be Stipe Miocic for Jon Jones for the UFC heavyweight title. And it's very simple. Francis Ngannou is more than deserving of the UFC heavyweight title shot. He has knocked out plenty of foe inside the UFC. I always say that, plenty of foe. But in particular, four straight fights, 4 straight knockouts. 2 of those knockouts were against former UFC heavyweight champions in Junior Dos Santos and Cain Velasquez. Another fight, Jairzinho Rozenstruik. Another fight, Curtis Blades. 2 guys that are contenders still in this division. Jairzinho Rozenstruik is coming off a win over Junior Dos Santos, and Curtis Blades always seems to be able to find himself within that contender conversation inside the UFC heavyweight division. So Francis Ngannou deserves a heavyweight title shot. But the tough part is, if you're the champion, Stipe Miocic, and this has been alluded to by Stipe, and I knew it was only a matter of time before we heard Stipe put out tweets or statements, whatever you want to call it, that, hey, I fought Francis Ngannou before. I beat Francis Ngannou before. I wrote the book on how to beat Francis Ngannou. I exposed Francis Ngannou in front of the whole world. It was a highly purchased pay-per-view, obviously not under the McGregor, point of view or landscape, but it was a fight that it's still locked in. It's still in our memory. It happened relatively relatively recently. So it's tough for Stipe, who's coming off of 3 straight fights over the same guy in Daniel Cormier, to, weird analogy, but to get out of bed for a fight with Jon Jones, or for a fight with, a fight with Francis Ngannou. For Stipe Miocic to get out of bed knowing that he's fighting the greatest light heavyweight of all time, for Stipe Miocic to get out of bed to take on the guy that he believes is the greatest of all time, what better test could you have as an athlete in any sport, whether it's fighting, football, baseball, hockey, to say, yeah, I'm taking on the best to ever do it. That's my next fight. What better motivation? What better a motivating factor? So I think if I'm Stipe, I am playing I am the baddest man on the planet card. I'm the champ of the heavyweight division. I'm the world heavyweight champ. that carries more moxie and is such a prestigious claim. It is the most prestigious claim in combat sports, dating back to Jack Dempsey, Joe Louis, Rocky Marciano, Muhammad Ali. In the boxing world, that shine carries over to that world heavyweight UFC champion, world heavyweight, the baddest man on the planet, Mike Tyson, reigned over the boxing heavyweight division, but the heavyweight landscape, that shine, that appeal just doesn't go away. So Stipe is somebody that I think needs to be more vocal in what he wants. And in his next fight, it has to be somebody that we can know, love, and respect as far as how that fight is sold to us. Granted, I highly respect Francis Ngannou. I think he is a world beater. I think he will be the heavyweight champion of the UFC one day. But being that we've already seen that fight, I think Stipe needs a fresh challenge. I think Stipe needs a fight that would put him over, or maybe the angle that it would put him over in terms of using a wrestling analogy. And if Jon Jones moves up from light heavyweight to heavyweight, the first fight that he should have is against the champion, is for a title, whether that's versus Stipe or whether that's versus Francis. If Francis does fight Stipe and gets past him, Jones deserves the opportunity to take on one of those guys. He's the greatest light heavyweight. And yeah, I'd be willing to say he belongs in the GOAT conversation. I do not consider him my GOAT. He's not considered to be my greatest of all time. But at the same time, he is one of the best. He is one of those guys that, yeah, he's the youngest heavyweight, the youngest UFC champion, the best light heavyweight ever in every single category. He has won more title fights than anyone. He surpassed George St. Pierre. He won 14 world title fights after that win over Dominic Reyes. And it was a decision. It was a controversial decision, but we can't deny those things. For every frustration that I have outside of the octagon, am I pointing to it right over here? The octagon, in terms of Jon Jones, I definitely believe Jon Jones is one of the best. And if he's moving up to heavyweight to add more appeal to that division, he's a massive name in the sport, and he does deserve a crack at a belt based on what he has accomplished. That's the fight right there. Jones moves up to heavyweight, takes on Stipe Miocic, and yeah, it sells to casual fans, it sells to hardcore fans, it sells to everyone. For Pete's sake, DC would even buy that pay-per-view. Probably be commentating that fight. That is interesting right there. That thought dwindling in my head of Daniel Cormier commentating a fight between Stipe and Jones, his two greatest rivals. That is what we need in UFC. That is what we need in mixed martial arts. So there you have it. I mean, there are other fights out there. Yeah, the Brock Lesnar fight, man, that would bring in some cha-ching. That would bring in some coin, no doubt about it. But in terms of what is deserved, not even, I think, to me, Stipe actually deserves this fight against Jon Jones more than Jon Jones deserves it against Stipe. And I think Jon Jones does deserve it against Stipe, but I think Stipe deserves it more than Jon Jones. Stipe has done more than enough as the heavyweight champion. Granted, he lost that fight to DC, the second one, or the first one. He avenged it in the second one, and then he won in the third fight, and it was a pretty dominant win in that third fight. He almost finished Daniel Cormier in that second round in the third fight. So that's where I'm at. That's what I'm talking about. That's the fight that I think is a fight that the folks that want to watch two big kahunas go at it, Miocic, Jones, world heavyweight title. Can Jon Jones add his name to the short list of fighters that have won two titles in two different weight classes? Can he do it? Is it possible? We'll see. I think that you have a ton of fights out there for Jon Jones that are entertaining, a ton of fights out there that make a ton of sense. But I want to move on to who I believe is going to win the Reyes versus Jan fight. And let's get that up and running. Reyes versus Jan, who will win and why? Me personally, I think Dominic Reyes will become the next UFC light heavyweight champion. And I think Reyes has the potential to be the UFC light heavyweight champion for quite some time. Call me crazy, but the athleticism of Dominic Reyes is pretty alarming, is second to none in terms of that UFC light heavyweight division. You had some killers in that UFC light heavyweight division. I want to see where the cream rises. Who's the cream that rises to the top? Anthony Rumble Johnson, rumblings of him coming back. You love to see it. I'm Ryan Thomas. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. This podcast is available on Facebook as well as YouTube. Also be streaming this onto Twitter in relatively short order. So thank you very much. Thanks for tuning in. Like the Thomas Take Sports Podcast Facebook page. You'll get access to anytime I'm live on here. And you will also be hearing me dive into plenty of MMA, boxing, football, fantasy football. If there's anybody that needs any fantasy football advice, it's you. It's not me. So I'm definitely looking forward to fantasy football season. I got not one, but 2 drafts tomorrow, and I'm thinking that it's going to be a hell of a year for me. Thinking more championships. Take care, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.